My name is Evelyn Barker. I'm 76 years old, and I live alone in a yellow house by the bay in Port Elmsworth, Massachusetts. It's a quiet town with fishing boats, gulls overhead, and porches that creak when the wind picks up. This house has been mine for over 40 years. My late husband, Charles, and I bought it when we were still dreaming about retirement and long walks by the water. Back then, we had plans to grow old together, drink tea on the porch, and maybe argue about crossword puzzles. He passed away 9 years ago, and since then, I've stayed. Not because I couldn't leave, but because I didn't want to. There's a kind of peace in these walls that I haven't found anywhere else. I'm not rich. I live on Charles's pension and what's left of my teaching retirement. I don't travel far or eat at fancy places, but I have what I need. I keep a small garden out back, go to the library on Fridays, and volunteer at the food bank when I can. What I love most is how the morning light hits the kitchen sink, or the sound of rain on the roof during autumn storms. Those things feel like home to me. They remind me of who I've always been, even when life tries to pull me in directions I didn't ask for. I've lived long enough to know when something feels off. And when it started, I told myself I was overthinking. But I wasn't. Looking back now, I can see the shift as clear as day. It started with a phone call, and a voice that didn't sound quite like the son I remembered. It started with more phone calls than usual. Dylan had never been the type to check in often, always busy with work or running around town with Amanda. But all of a sudden, he was calling every other day, asking questions that felt strange even though they were framed as concern. He asked if I was sleeping well, if I remembered to take my vitamins, if I ever got confused about where I put things. At first, I thought maybe he was just going through a thoughtful phase. I told myself to be grateful, but something about it didn't sit right. Then came the visit. They drove up from Boston and showed up on a Sunday morning, cheerful smiles and a bag of groceries in hand. I hadn't seen them in months, so I did my best to make the place feel warm, like home. We sat in the living room for a bit. Amanda complimented my crocheted throw pillows, but her eyes didn't match her voice. Dylan kept looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time, as if trying to remember the layout. They offered to help with chores, but somehow that turned into them wandering room to room. Amanda lingered in the hallway near the bedrooms while Dylan poked his head into the attic crawl space. It didn't feel like family. It felt like realtors casing a property. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just noticing how things had aged, how the floorboards creaked, how the paint had faded in the guest room. Still, when I caught Amanda whispering to Dylan while they thought I was in the kitchen, I felt my stomach turn. Over dinner, they brought it up. Amanda was smiling too hard, like she was trying to soften the blow. Dylan said they had been talking about how wonderful it would be for me to live in a community with other seniors. Just until things got easier. I looked at them both, trying to keep my voice steady. I asked what exactly they thought was getting hard. Amanda reached across the table, touched my hand, and said something about peace of mind. She mentioned a place called Silver Willows, just 20 minutes away, with gardens and group painting classes. The whole thing felt rehearsed. I had never mentioned feeling lonely, or overwhelmed, or unsafe. I cooked my own meals, managed my bills, and even helped out at the library on Wednesdays. But none of that seemed to matter. I tried to shift the conversation, asked how Dylan's work was going, whether Amanda's niece had gotten into college, but they barely bit. Their answers were short, as if distracted, like they had already moved on in their minds to something else. That night, after they left, I stood at the window watching their taillights disappear. I wanted to believe they meant well. But deep down, something inside me knew better. The next morning, I found a brochure tucked into the side pocket of the bag Amanda brought. Silver Willows, full-color pages, smiling gray-haired people doing Tai Chi in the sun. My name wasn't on any wait list, but it felt like a decision had already been made. I tried to brush it off, made a pot of tea, sat in the rocker Charles used to love, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been walked through like an open house. My books, my pictures, my kitchen cabinets, they weren't just noticed. They were measured. The rest of the week passed quietly, but not peacefully. I kept waiting for another call, another drop-by. I checked the locks before bed, not out of fear, but out of unease. Sometimes it's not what people say that sticks with you. It's the way they linger a second too long in a room that's not theirs. The way they speak to each other when they think you're not listening. The way you suddenly feel like a guest in your own home. It happened on a Thursday morning. I had just poured my second cup of coffee when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I opened it anyway, thinking maybe it was the mail carrier or a neighbor needing help with something. Instead, it was a man I didn't recognize. He wore a windbreaker with a small badge clipped to the front and introduced himself as someone from Elder Services. He said they had received a call and needed to perform a wellness check. My heart picked up, not out of fear but confusion. I asked who had called, but he said it was anonymous. He was polite, but there was a stiffness in his tone, the kind you hear from someone doing something they don't quite believe in but are required to do anyway. I let him in. He walked through the house slowly, peeking into the kitchen, checking the smoke detectors, asking how I kept track of my medications. I showed him my pill organizer, told him I took care of all my own appointments, even gave him the number to my doctor. He opened the fridge, nodded at the stocked shelves, asked if I ever got turned around or forgot how to get home from the library. I answered calmly, though my cheeks were burning. It felt like a quiz I hadn't studied for, even though I knew all the answers. After about 20 minutes, he closed his notepad and said I seemed fine. More than fine, actually. He smiled, told me to take care, and left with a quiet kind of kindness that only made the whole visit feel heavier. I stood in the hallway for a long time after the door shut. The silence felt thick, like the house was holding its breath. Something was wrong, and now I knew it wasn't just in my head. The letter came a few days later. It arrived in a stiff white envelope with my full name typed in bold across the front. Inside was a petition filed by my son Dylan, requesting temporary guardianship. He had claimed I was mentally declining, that I had left the stove on, that I was prone to confusion and unable to manage my affairs. I read it twice. Then a third time, hoping I'd misunderstood, but each word cut deeper than the last. My own son had gone to court and told them I was no longer capable of living my life. My hands shook as I folded the letter back into its envelope. I sat in my reading chair, the one Charles had repaired when the leg cracked years ago, and stared out the window without really seeing anything at all. I didn't cry. Not then. I just felt cold. Not from the weather, but from the way something familiar had suddenly twisted into something I didn't recognize. I called Dylan that night, still trying to make sense of it. I asked him why. His voice was calm, too calm, like he was reading from a script. He told me it was for my own safety, that the house was too much, that I didn't know how bad things had gotten. He spoke to me like I was already gone, like the woman who raised him, who sat up with him through fevers and heartbreak, had somehow disappeared without anyone noticing. That was the part that hurt the most. It wasn't just the paperwork, it wasn't even the lies. It was hearing my own child talk about me like I was an obstacle, a burden, something to be managed. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the front window, the letter still on the table beside me, and watched the porch light flicker in the wind. Everything I had built felt like it was slipping away, and I didn't know yet how to stop it. But I knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't love. This was something else. The morning after that call with Dylan, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee until it went cold. His words kept playing in my mind, not the content so much as the tone, calm, practiced. Like a nurse reciting instructions to a patient who didn't quite get it. I wasn't confused. I wasn't lost. But I was beginning to understand something I didn't want to admit. This wasn't about care. It was about control. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt the steady push behind every phone call, every polite suggestion, every tight smile from Amanda. I pulled out my file box from the hall closet, the one where I keep all my important papers, labeled and neat. I wanted to see if anything had changed that I hadn't noticed. Bank accounts, property records, mail I might have overlooked in the past few weeks. That's when I found it. A copy of a form filed with the town office, dated just a week before the wellness check. It stated that I had requested to transfer ownership of my house into a family trust, managed by Evelyn Barker. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. But it wasn't. The handwriting looked shaky, nothing like my usual loops and straight lines. My name was spelled right, but the way it was written made my stomach drop. It was someone pretending to be me, and not doing a very good job of it. I felt like the room tilted slightly. I put the paper down, took a breath, and picked it up again. I turned it over like there might be some other explanation on the back, something to tell me this was all just a clerical error. But there wasn't. I stood at the kitchen sink and let the faucet run while I stared out the window. The garden hadn't been weeded in a week, and the hose was coiled up neatly where I had left it. I was still doing everything I always had. I hadn't missed a single bill. I hadn't forgotten a thing. And still, he was trying to take my home out from under me. Quietly, legally, like I wouldn't notice until it was done. That was the part that burned the most. I needed help, not the kind he thought I needed. Not a nurse, not a facility. I needed someone who knew how these things worked, who could see through the polite words and legal tricks and help me hold my ground. I called my friend Judith, who used to work in the assessor's office before she retired. She knew everyone in town and everything that had ever passed through City Hall. I told her what I found. She went quiet for a long moment, then said she knew someone I should talk to. His name was Frank Holloway. Used to be a private investigator out of Portland, now semi-retired, but still took on cases involving elder fraud and financial abuse. She said he had a good heart and better eyes than most. I wrote his number down on the back of an old grocery list and called the next morning. Frank agreed to meet me at a diner just outside of town. He was already there when I walked in, sitting in a booth with a manila folder and a black coffee. He looked up, smiled once, and slid into business without fuss. I liked that. I handed him everything I had: the legal letter, the copy of the property transfer, my notes from that strange visit with Dylan and Amanda. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, one hand resting on the edge of the table, the other turning over pages like he was solving a puzzle he'd seen before. After I finished, he sat back and looked at me with something that felt like both caution and respect. He said this wasn't the first case he'd seen like this. Families calling it love, but underneath it was all about assets, leverage, and timing. He told me we had to move quickly. That was the first time I didn't feel helpless. Not angry, not yet, but focused, alert. I still didn't know how bad it would get, but I knew I wasn't going to let them walk me out of my own life without a fight. Frank didn't waste time. 2 days after our meeting, he showed up at my front porch with a folder of documents and a voice recorder small enough to hide in my knitting basket. He explained that if Dylan called again, I should keep things light, act as if nothing had changed, and let him talk. It felt strange at first. I wasn't used to playing along, but there was something steady in Frank's presence that made it easier. He wasn't loud or dramatic. He was focused, patient, and always looking one step ahead. He helped me organize every piece of paper tied to the house: tax records, insurance documents, utilities, even old maintenance receipts. Then we went through my bank statements line by line, marking anything that looked odd or out of place. He talked about patterns, about how people like Dylan usually didn't start with one big move. They chipped away first, a suggestion here, a signature there. By the time you realized what had happened, the damage was already done. He referred me to a lawyer named Julia Reese. She specialized in elder rights and estate protection. Julia was sharp, maybe the sharpest woman I'd ever met. She didn't smile much, but when she did, it was real. I trusted her almost immediately. When I told her about the forged property transfer, she nodded slowly and said it wasn't the first time she'd seen something like it. She told me we could challenge the guardianship petition, but we needed to act fast. We needed documentation, proof. Anything that showed Dylan's intentions were not about care, but about control. That's when the phone rang. It was Dylan. His voice had that same even tone, like nothing unusual had happened between us. He asked how I was holding up and said Amanda had found some helpful resources about senior housing. I tucked the recorder into my lap and let him talk. He circled the topic like a vulture, not quite landing but not flying away either. Then he slipped. He mentioned that a family friend in real estate had looked into the value of the property, that it might be smart to explore the market while things were still in good condition. He said things like maximize value and long-term planning and legacy. What he didn't say was how I felt about any of it. He didn't ask what I wanted. He talked as though I wasn't even part of the equation, like I had already been filed away under something manageable. When the call ended, I played it back for Frank. He didn't say much, just pressed stop and nodded once. Then he handed the file to Julia, who listened to it twice, writing notes the whole time. That recording changed everything. From that moment on, I moved with quiet purpose. I still drank my morning tea by the window and walked to the post office on Tuesdays. I still chatted with neighbors and smiled at the kids riding bikes past the hedge. But behind every gentle moment was the rhythm of preparation. Frank came by every few days. We'd sit on the porch like old friends, but in between sips of lemonade we traded updates and reviewed timelines. Julia filed a formal objection to the guardianship, attaching letters from my doctor, neighbors, and the librarian at the food bank where I volunteered. She included photos of my pantry, my yard, and the journal I kept of everything Dylan and Amanda had said since that strange visit. Each document was a brick in the wall we were building, not to keep people out, but to hold something in place: my life, my voice, my right to exist without interference. I didn't yell, I didn't throw accusations. I just stayed the course. I kept my records clean and my tone even. I let them underestimate me. And in the quiet, something started to shift. I no longer felt scared every time the phone rang or the mail came. I wasn't waiting for the next blow. I was standing still, but I wasn't stuck. I was ready. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before sunrise. The sky outside was a soft gray, the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. I made a cup of tea but didn't finish it. I stood in front of my closet for a long time, running my fingers across hangers I hadn't touched in years. I didn't want to look impressive. I wanted to feel like myself. I chose a navy blue wool coat Charles had given me on our 25th anniversary, a simple pearl necklace my mother left me, and a pair of low heels that had carried me through PTA meetings, weddings, and funerals. When Frank picked me up, he didn't say much, just nodded and opened the door like always. The drive was quiet, but not in a heavy way. It felt steady, like the road had already decided where it was taking me. The courthouse sat on a corner lot with chipped columns and faded brick, the kind of place that made you feel small if you let it, but I didn't, not that day. I walked in with my shoulders back and my chin up, not to impress anyone but to remind myself that I belonged there. Julia was already waiting, flipping through papers with her usual sharp focus. She looked up, gave me a single, firm nod, and said we were ready. I believed her. Inside the courtroom, the lights were too bright and the air too dry. Dylan sat across the aisle, polished and calm, like a man walking into a business meeting. Amanda was next to him, flipping through her phone like she had somewhere else to be. They didn't look at me. The judge entered, a woman with kind but steady eyes. Her robe swayed slightly as she sat, and the room fell into that strange, heavy quiet that only courtrooms seem to know. Dylan Slavier went first. He spoke with measured concern, painting me as a lonely widow, vulnerable to forgetfulness and confusion. He referenced the wellness check, twisting it into a narrative that made me sound fragile. He said things like safety and protection and dignity, but every word felt like a wall being built around me, one I hadn't asked for. Then it was Julia's turn. She called me to the stand and guided me with questions that were careful, respectful, and sharp. I talked about my daily routine, my garden, the library, the food bank. I explained how I handled my finances, how I paid my bills on time, how I stayed in touch with neighbors and friends. I could feel the room listening, not just hearing, but listening. Julia handed the judge a medical evaluation from my doctor, letters from my neighbors, and photos of my pantry and bookshelf. Then she reached into her briefcase and pulled out the small recorder. She played the call. Dylan's voice filled the room, calm, composed, and completely unaware he was being recorded. He spoke about market value, about getting ahead of the process, about a buyer who was already interested. He never once asked how I was doing, never once mentioned my wishes. The room didn't move. You could feel it. The shift, the realization. It wasn't care. It was convenience. It wasn't love. It was leverage. Then came the forged signature. Julia presented a side-by-side comparison, my real one and the one on the property transfer request. Even to an untrained eye, they were nothing alike. The judge stared at them for a long moment before setting the papers down. She looked directly at me, then at Dylan. Her voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. She said there was no evidence of cognitive decline, no cause for guardianship, and every reason to believe the petition had been filed under false and self-serving pretenses. She denied the request. Fully. She added that any further attempt without clear and compelling evidence would carry legal consequences. She said I had the right to live independently, and no one could take that from me. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't just relief. It was release. As I stood to leave, Dylan tried to approach me. Amanda hovered behind him, arms folded tight. He said he wanted to talk, that he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he was only trying to help. I looked him in the eye. The boy I raised was still in there somewhere, but I couldn't see him in that moment. I told him he had made his choice, and so had I. Frank walked me out to the car. The sky had cleared. The sunlight hit the sidewalk in patches, warm and quiet. It didn't feel like victory, not in the loud way people expect. It felt like breath, like space, like coming home to myself. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for the next thing. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I had fought, I had stood up, and I had been heard. The week after the hearing, I had the locks changed, not because I thought anyone would come charging through the door, but because it felt like a clean start. I stood by the front steps as the locksmith worked, the old keys in my pocket and the weight of what almost happened finally starting to lift. I called Julia the next morning and canceled the power of attorney I had once given Dylan without thinking twice. We rewrote my will. This time, with a clause that made it clear anyone who attempted to take control without consent would be removed from everything. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I had learned something hard and necessary about trust. Frank came by a few days later with a bag of soil and a flat of herbs. He helped me dig out a small patch near the back fence where Charles had always meant to start a garden but never got around to it. We planted basil, rosemary, and thyme. I hadn't felt dirt under my nails in a long while, and I didn't realize how much I missed it. Inside the house, I moved slower, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to pay attention. I walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, lifting old books from shelves, opening drawers I hadn't thought about in years. Every item held something, a memory, a moment, a piece of me I nearly lost. Neighbors started stopping by more often. Little things. A jar of jam, a new library recommendation, a quiet knock on the door just to say they were glad I was still here. I didn't need their approval, but I felt their respect. I started sleeping with the window open again. The sound of the bay was always there, like a heartbeat. I made bread for the first time in months. I read on the porch instead of in the kitchen. I said yes to small things that made the days feel full without being busy. The house didn't change, but I had. I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. I had stood still in the middle of a storm and come out standing. That mattered more than anything. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't the court dates or the forged papers. It wasn't even the shock of seeing my own child turn me into a problem to be managed. What hurt the most was how long I tried to explain it away. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself Amanda meant well. I gave so many passes in the name of love that I stopped noticing when I stopped being heard. When you raise someone, you hold them through every ache and mistake. You hope that love writes itself into their bones. But love, real love, should never cost you your dignity. Being someone's mother didn't mean I had to surrender my voice. Family doesn't give anyone the right to decide who you are or what you can keep. And age doesn't mean you disappear. For a while, I felt like I was slowly being erased. Not with one cruel act, but with small dismissals, quiet decisions made without me. They tried to call it care, but underneath, it was control. I don't share this story because I want pity. I share it because I know there are others out there who feel the same. Maybe it's a daughter who's been sidelined, a father being pushed into silence, a grandmother whose decisions are questioned more than they're respected. To anyone watching who feels that slow slip like your life is being managed instead of lived, please hear me. You are still the author of your story. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to draw the line and hold it. It took a courtroom for me to reclaim what I nearly lost, but the real change started much smaller. It started with a moment of clarity, a quiet decision that I didn't need to apologize for existing. Strength doesn't always look like shouting or slamming a door. Sometimes, it's planting basil where someone tried to build doubt. Sometimes, it's sitting in your favorite chair, knowing you fought for it. Sometimes, it's simply staying. If this story reminds you of someone in your life or maybe even yourself, please share it. Leave a comment if you've been through something similar, or just let someone know they aren't alone. Because the truth is, the most powerful kind of resistance isn't loud. It's steady. It's clear. It's the quiet decision to live your life fully and on your own terms. And I'm doing just that. Every morning, one breath at a time.